The word left my mouth before my brain had any chance to intercept it, tumbling out into the fluorescent lit aisle of a grocery store as naturally as breathing. And by the time I heard myself say it, it was already hanging in the air between us, impossible to take back, impossible to explain away as anything other than exactly what it sounded like. I had turned to ask her opinion on which brand of coffee to buy, the way I had done 1,000 ordinary times before, and instead of her name, the word baby slipped out instead, soft and unthinking and utterly unmistakable. She went very still, a jar of instant coffee suspended halfway to the cart, and when she finally looked up at me, her cheeks were flushed a deep, unmistakable red, and she said 4 words that undid 7 years of careful, deliberate silence between us. I've waited so long. I want you to understand, before I tell you how we got to that aisle, that neither of us had ever said anything like that to each other before. Not once. Not even as a joke. In 7 years of a friendship so close that people constantly mistook us for a couple anyway. Her name is Meher, and this is the story of how one accidental word in a grocery store finally forced 2 frightened, stubborn people to stop pretending they didn't already know the truth. Meher and I met during our first week of university, assigned as lab partners in a chemistry course. Neither of us particularly enjoyed, brought together by nothing more romantic than alphabetical seating charts, and the shared misery of a professor who graded on an impossible curve. She was, from the very first day, unlike anyone I had ever known, sharp-tongued and quick to laugh, fiercely loyal to the handful of people she let close, and possessed of a particular kind of directness that some people found intimidating, and I found immediately helplessly endearing. We started as study partners out of necessity, and became something closer to inseparable within a single semester. The kind of friendship that develops its own private language, its own inside jokes, its own unspoken rules about who orders what at which restaurant, and who always drives home when the other has had 1 drink too many. By our second year, we were the friend group's fixed point. The 2 people everyone assumed would eventually end up together, an assumption we both laughed off with practiced ease every single time it surfaced, usually with some variation of the same joke that we knew each other far too well to ever survive dating, that we functioned better as each other's built-in family than as anything more complicated. I told that joke so many times over the years that I nearly convinced myself it was true, and I suspect, though I would only learn this much later, that Meher was telling herself the same lie with the same practiced conviction. The truth, the one I spent years refusing to examine too closely, was that I had been quietly, thoroughly in love with Meher since sometime during our 3rd year of university, though I couldn't point to a single defining moment when friendship tipped over into something larger. It happened gradually, the way most important shifts in a person's heart tend to happen, accumulating in small, ordinary moments rather than arriving all at once. It happened the night she sat with me in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours after my younger brother's motorcycle accident, holding my hand without once asking me to explain what I was feeling, simply present in the exact way I needed without requiring instruction. It happened the year she noticed, before I fully admitted it to myself, that I was quietly struggling with anxiety severe enough to affect my coursework, and instead of pushing me toward professional help, the way well-meaning friends sometimes clumsily do, she simply started attending my most stressful classes with me, sitting in the back so I would know someone familiar was nearby if the panic became too much. It happened during the countless nights we spent talking on her apartment floor about everything and nothing, falling asleep sometimes mid-conversation, waking up to find she had draped a blanket over me before heading to her own bed, rather than waking me to leave. I never said anything, not during university, not during the years immediately after, because I had built an entire philosophy of self-protection around the specific fear that naming my feelings would cost me the single most important relationship in my life. I had watched enough friends confess feelings to close friends and lose the friendship entirely in the aftermath, the relationship curdling into an awkwardness neither person could fully recover from. And I decided, somewhere along the way, that having Meher fully as a friend was worth infinitely more than risking her partially, or not at all, as something more. I told myself this was wisdom. I understand now that it was simply fear wearing a more respectable disguise. Meher, for her part, gave me every reason over the years to suspect that perhaps I wasn't imagining a deeper current beneath our friendship, though I spent years dismissing each of those reasons individually rather than allowing myself to see the pattern they formed together. She kept a photograph of the two of us from our graduation day on her nightstand, a detail I noticed but never questioned. She once told a mutual friend, during a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear, that she had turned down a man's fairly serious interest because nobody makes me laugh the way he does. A comment, I convinced myself, was simply an offhand compliment rather than a confession. She remembered, without fail, the anniversary of my brother's accident every single year, calling or texting on that difficult date, before I even had the chance to feel alone in my grief. A level of attentiveness I told myself was simply how Meffer is with everyone, even though I privately knew she wasn't nearly that attentive with anyone else. We both dated other people over the years, though our respective relationships followed a strikingly similar, and in hindsight, deeply telling pattern. I dated a woman named Priya for almost 2 years, a genuinely kind, easy relationship that nonetheless ended when Priya finally, gently, told me during our breakup conversation that she had spent 2 years competing with a friendship she could never quite understand or match, that she always felt like the second most important person in my life despite dating me, and that she deserved a partner who saw her as the priority, rather than as someone slotted carefully around an already full emotional life. I was devastated by that breakup at the time, genuinely so, but even in my devastation, some small, honest part of me recognized that she wasn't wrong, and that recognition frightened me too much to examine closely. Meher's relationships followed an almost identical trajectory. She dated a man named Arjun for over a year, someone I genuinely liked and got along with easily until Arjun, too, eventually ended things, telling her with visible frustration that he had spent over a year trying to compete with a friendship that seemed to take precedence over everything else in her life, myself included by name, and that he was tired of feeling like a guest in a house that already had a permanent occupant. Meher came to my apartment the night that relationship ended, sat on my couch, and cried in a way I had rarely seen from her, and I held her that night without once asking myself the obvious question of why the ending of her relationship with another man devastated me almost as much as it devastated her. This pattern repeated itself, with minor variations for years, both of us moving through a string of relationships that inevitably foundered against the same immovable obstacle, both of us calling it bad luck or incompatibility with our respective partners, rather than confronting the far more uncomfortable truth that we had already, unknowingly, given the most important parts of ourselves to each other years earlier, leaving little enough room for anyone else to occupy the space that should have belonged to a romantic partner. The years accumulated the way years do, quietly, and then suddenly all at once. We moved into apartments in the same building without ever formally discussing it as anything more than convenient, the kind of decision two best friends make without examining the deeper implications of choosing to live down the hall from each other, rather than anywhere else in an entire city. We built careers alongside each other, Mefer working her way up in urban planning while I settled into a stable position in software development. Both of us successful enough to build independent, comfortable lives, and yet somehow always structuring those lives around each other's schedules. Her work trips always coordinated around my birthday, so she'd be present. My vacation days always aligned with hers so we could travel together at least once a year, an arrangement so normalized between us that neither of us questioned how unusual it might look from the outside. My mother, during a rare visit 2 years before the grocery store incident that finally changed everything, sat me down over dinner and asked me, with the particular bluntness only mothers seem to possess, why I had spent nearly a decade of my adult life building an entire existence around a woman I refused to call anything more than a friend. I gave her every practiced excuse I had accumulated over the years that Mefer and I understood each other too well to risk it, that some friendships were simply too valuable to complicate with romance, that we had both tried other relationships and neither of us wanted to force something that clearly wasn't meant to happen between us specifically. My mother listened to all of this with visible patience, and then told me something that lodged itself uncomfortably in my mind for months afterward. She said that she had met plenty of couples over her lifetime who fell in love quickly and burned out just as fast, and far fewer who built something slow and steady and tested across nearly a decade before either of them found the courage to name it. and that she worried I was so afraid of losing Meher as a friend that I was actively preventing myself from ever truly having her at all. I dismissed her concern at the time, the way I dismissed every uncomfortable truth that surfaced over those years, filing it away in the same mental drawer where I kept every other piece of evidence I refused to examine too closely. The months leading up to the grocery store incident were, in hindsight, a slow unraveling of the careful equilibrium Meher and I had maintained for so long. Her company had begun discussing an expansion into a regional office located nearly 4 hours away by train, and Meher, ambitious and talented enough to be an obvious candidate for the position, leading that expansion, found herself seriously considering an opportunity that would have been an easy, uncomplicated yes for anyone else in her position. She mentioned it to me first, before mentioning it to anyone else, sitting on my couch on an ordinary Wednesday evening, with the specific hesitation of someone testing how a piece of news might land before committing to a decision. I remember exactly how my chest tightened at the thought of her potentially moving 4 hours away, a physical, visceral reaction that went far beyond what a friend, even a very close friend, should reasonably feel about another friend's career opportunity. I told her, with a calm I didn't remotely feel, that she should absolutely consider the position seriously if it represented meaningful career growth, that I didn't want my own preferences to factor into a decision that's significant for her future. Every word of that encouragement was sincere in its intention and completely dishonest in its omission, because what I actually wanted to say, and didn't, was that the thought of building a life without her physically present in it felt less like an adjustment and more like an amputation. Meher, for her part, grew quieter over the following weeks as the decision deadline approached, and I noticed, though I again failed to properly interpret, that she seemed to be watching me carefully during our conversations about the opportunity, as though waiting for some specific reaction from me that never quite arrived, because I kept carefully modulating my response into supportive neutrality. She told me, nearly 6 weeks before the grocery store incident, that she had narrowed her decision down to accepting the position, citing the genuine career advancement it represented, and I responded with what I intended as warm, generous encouragement, and what I now understand she likely experienced as devastating, casual indifference to the possibility of losing each other's daily presence. I didn't sleep properly for nearly a week after that conversation. I found myself lying awake calculating the specific ways my daily life would change, without her down the hall, without our impromptu dinners, without the accumulated small rituals that had structured nearly a decade of my adult existence around her presence. I understood, with a clarity that frightened me precisely because it arrived so late, that I was not simply afraid of losing a close friend's convenient proximity. I was afraid of losing the person I loved most in the world, a fact I had spent 9 years carefully avoiding and could no longer pretend not to know. I want to be honest about why I still didn't say anything during those 6 weeks, because the reasons matter for understanding everything that came after. I had convinced myself over nearly a decade that confessing my feelings to Meher carried an unacceptable risk, that even if she somehow felt the same way, which I had trained myself not to hope for too directly, the transition from friendship to romance carried its own dangers, and that if the romantic relationship eventually failed the way most romantic relationships eventually do, I would lose not just a partner, but the single most important friendship of my adult life, the two of us unable to return to the easy, uncomplicated closeness we'd built over so many years. I told myself that keeping her as a friend, even one who was about to move 4 hours away, was safer than risking everything on a confession that might unravel the entire foundation of my life. I understand now, though I didn't understand it then, that I was making the exact same cowardly calculation I had watched destroy 2 of my own relationships, and at least one of hers, mistaking self-protection for wisdom. 3 weeks before the grocery store incident, Meher formally accepted the regional position, with a start date set for 2 months later, and she told me the news over coffee at our usual cafe, with a brightness that felt, even to my unreliable perception, slightly forced around the edges. I congratulated her sincerely, genuinely proud of her professional accomplishment, even as some part of me was quietly grieving the arrangement I had spent 9 years building my entire adult life around. We spent the following weeks in a strange, suspended state, both of us aware that a significant change was approaching, neither of us willing to name the actual weight of what that change might mean for whatever we had never properly defined between us. The grocery store incident happened on an entirely unremarkable Saturday afternoon, 11 days before Meher's scheduled move. During what had become one of our final ordinary weekend routines together, our shared grocery run. A ritual we'd maintained for years, splitting the cost of household staples we both used and turning what should have been a tedious errand into one of our favorite weekly rituals, full of easy conversation and the specific, comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every quiet moment with words. We were standing in the coffee aisle, debating between two brands the way we debated this exact choice nearly every single week. When I turned to ask her opinion, my mind somewhere between the grocery list and the quiet, persistent grief I'd been carrying for weeks about her impending move, and the word that left my mouth instead of her name was simply, unmistakably, baby. I heard myself say it a half-second after it had already escaped, and by then, it was far too late to reclaim it, hanging in the fluorescent-lit air between us with a weight that felt entirely disproportionate to a single syllable, slipped out over instant coffee. Meher went completely still, the jar of coffee suspended halfway between the shelf and her cart, and I watched in the space of what felt like several extremely long seconds, her expression shift through surprise, then something more vulnerable, before settling into an unmistakable, deep flush that spread across her cheeks, in a way I had genuinely never seen on her before in 9 years of friendship. I opened my mouth to apologize, to laugh it off, to offer some quick deflecting joke the way I had deflected every uncomfortable emotional truth between us for nearly a decade. And before I could produce a single word of that practiced deflection, she looked up at me and said, so quietly that I almost missed it beneath the store's ambient noise, I've waited so long. I want you to understand exactly how those 4 words landed, because they didn't sound like surprise or confusion or the kind of response you'd expect from someone genuinely startled by an accidental slip of the tongue. They sounded like relief. They sounded like a door, finally, after 9 years being allowed to open. If you believe that the truths we're most afraid to say are often the truths most worth saying, if you believe in the quiet, terrifying courage it takes to finally name what you've spent years protecting yourself from admitting, take a moment right now to like this video, comment and tell me where you're watching from. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that it's never too late to tell the truth, and subscribe to this channel, because we tell these stories precisely for moments like the one Meher and I were about to have. Standing frozen in a grocery store aisle with 9 years of unspoken history finally cracking open between us. Neither of us moved for what felt like an impossibly long time, other shoppers passing our cart with mild, uninterested glances, entirely unaware that the two people standing motionless in the coffee aisle were undergoing the most significant conversation of their adult lives without having spoken more than 5 words to each other. I finally found my voice enough to ask her, carefully, what exactly she meant, though some cowardly part of me already understood precisely what she meant and was simply buying myself a few more seconds before the conversation became irreversible. She set the coffee jar down slowly, deliberately, as though she needed both hands free for whatever she was about to say, and told me, in a voice that trembled slightly despite her obvious effort to keep it steady, that she had been waiting 9 years for me to call her something other than a friend, that she had spent nearly a decade convincing herself that I simply didn't feel the way she felt, that she had accepted the regional position partly, though she hadn't admitted this even to herself until this exact moment, because some exhausted part of her had decided that if I was never going to say anything, she needed enough physical distance to finally stop hoping. I stood there in that aisle surrounded by shelves of coffee and tea neither of us was paying attention to anymore, and I finally said the thing I had spent 9 years too afraid to say. I told her that the word hadn't been an accident at all. Not really. That some part of my mind had apparently decided to say the truth my conscious mind had kept carefully locked away for nearly a decade, and that I loved her, had loved her for years longer than I'd ever allowed myself to properly admit, and that the thought of her moving 4 hours away in 11 days had been quietly destroying me precisely because I understood, finally and completely, that I wasn't afraid of losing a close friend's convenient proximity. I was afraid of losing the person I loved most in the entire world, and I had let that fear keep me silent for far longer than either of us deserved. She started crying then, right there in the coffee aisle, the specific kind of crying that comes from years of carefully held tension finally finding release. and I pulled her into a hug that felt entirely different from the hundreds of hugs we'd shared over 9 years of friendship, charged now with an honesty neither of us had allowed ourselves before. A store employee restocking a nearby shelf glanced over with polite curiosity, and neither of us cared even slightly, standing there in that unremarkable aisle, finally saying, out loud, the truth we had both been circling for nearly a decade. We left our half-filled cart with an apologetic explanation to a bemused cashier and walked to a small park 2 blocks from the store, needing space and air and the ability to talk without an audience. And we sat on a bench for nearly 3 hours that afternoon, finally excavating 9 years of carefully buried feeling. Meher told me about the specific moment she had first realized her feelings for me had shifted beyond friendship, a night during our 4th year of university when I had shown up at her apartment at 2 inches the morning after a difficult call with my parents, and she had simply held me without asking a single question, and somewhere in that quiet, unglamorous moment of comfort, she understood that what she felt for me went far deeper than ordinary friendship, though she had spent the following 5 years convincing herself otherwise out of the exact same fear I had been carrying. She told me about the specific ache of watching me date Priya for 2 years, forcing herself to be genuinely supportive, because that was what a good friend did, while privately grieving something she'd never given herself permission to claim as her own. To grieve. She told me that accepting the regional position had been, if she was completely honest, a kind of last resort, an attempt to build enough distance to finally move on from feelings she had begun to believe would never be reciprocated. I told her, in turn, about every moment over the years I had similarly convinced myself my feelings were simply an especially deep friendship rather than something more, about the specific fear that had governed nearly all of my romantic caution for a decade. The fear that confessing feelings to my closest friend risked losing not just a potential relationship, but the single most stabilizing relationship of my entire adult life. I told her about my mother's warning 2 years earlier, about the discomfort of recognizing its truth, even as I dismissed it at the time. I told her that watching her prepare to leave in 11 days had finally, after 9 years, made the cost of my silence unbearable enough to override the fear that had kept me quiet for so long. Even before the accidental word in the grocery store had forced the conversation, before I was fully ready to have it on my own initiative. We didn't resolve everything in that single afternoon on the park bench, because 9 years of carefully maintained emotional caution doesn't unravel completely in a single conversation. However honest, but we made one decision together before the sun set that day, a decision that reshaped the trajectory both of us had been quietly, separately grieving for weeks. Meher called her company's regional office the following Monday, and after a series of honest conversations with her manager about her circumstances, was able to negotiate an alternative arrangement, taking on select responsibilities for the regional expansion, while remaining based in our home city. An arrangement that required some professional compromise on her part, but that she told me, without hesitation, felt like an easy sacrifice compared to what she would have been walking away from otherwise. The following months were not without their own complications, because transitioning nearly a decade of established friendship into a romantic relationship required both of us to relearn certain patterns that had calcified over the years into habits that no longer quite fit who we were trying to become together. We had arguments in those early months about boundaries neither of us had ever needed to negotiate as friends, about the specific vulnerability of depending on each other. Now, not just for friendship, but for romantic partnership, a dependency that occasionally frightened us both in its intensity. We sought guidance, at Meher's sensible suggestion, from a couples counselor for several months, not because our relationship was in crisis, but because we both recognized the value of building this new chapter of our relationship deliberately rather than simply assuming 9 years of friendship would automatically translate into a healthy romantic partnership without any conscious effort. My mother, when I finally told her the news, wept with a relief so visible it embarrassed me slightly, though she quickly composed herself enough to remind me, with gentle but unmistakable satisfaction, that she had told me so nearly 2 years earlier. Meher's parents, who had known me for nearly a decade as their daughter's closest friend, received the news with similar warmth, her father telling me during our first dinner together as an official couple that he had long ago stopped being surprised by how thoroughly I was already integrated into their family, and that formalizing our relationship simply gave a proper name to something he'd considered inevitable for years. If this story has moved something in you tonight, if it reminded you of your own quiet fears, your own years of protecting a friendship instead of risking something deeper, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs the reminder that the truth, however frightening, is almost always worth the risk of speaking it aloud. Tell me in the comments about a moment in your own life when an accidental word or unplanned moment finally forced a truth you had been too afraid to say on your own. Your stories matter deeply to this community, and this channel exists because so many of you continue showing up to remind each other that hope and honesty are always worth the risk. Before I close this story, I want to ask something small but meaningful of you. If the phrase "I've waited so long" resonates with something quiet in your own heart tonight, something you've been holding back from someone important in your life, type the word "waited" in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know how many of you are carrying your own version of 9 years of unspoken truth, waiting for the right accidental moment or the right deliberate courage to finally let it out. Meher and I have been together for 2 years now, and we still, occasionally, buy the wrong brand of coffee out of habit, laughing every single time about the specific aisle where 9 years of careful silence finally gave way to something neither of us had the courage to name on our own. We moved in together properly last spring, no longer simply neighbors down the hall from each other, but partners building an actual shared life, and she still keeps that same graduation photograph on her nightstand, though now it sits beside a newer photograph from the day I proposed, which happened, fittingly, in the exact same grocery store aisle where an accidentally spoken word first cracked open 9 years of careful protection. She said yes before I had even fully finished the question, laughing through tears in a way that mirrored, almost exactly, the way she had looked at me the day the whole truth of us finally, accidentally, came pouring out over a shelf of ordinary instant coffee. If there is one thing I hope you take from this story tonight, it is this. Sometimes the truths we spend years protecting ourselves from admitting are exactly the truths capable of giving us the life we didn't realize we'd been quietly waiting for all along. And sometimes, all it takes to finally say them is one unguarded, accidental word you never meant to let slip.